There is a particular kind of stillness in a man who says he is fine. Not the stillness of resolution, not the stillness of peace, but something closer to the stillness of a system that has been running so long it no longer registers its own load. He is not lying. That is the first thing to understand. When he says he is fine, he means it in the only way the word still functions for him, as a report on operational status. The machine is running, output is being produced, no emergency is currently visible, and the answer is fine, delivered without hesitation. You have probably said it the same way, not as deception, but as the most accurate description available within the vocabulary you were given for this particular question, the vocabulary that was handed to you early and which you have never fully audited. I want to look at what happens in the space between what he says and what is actually occurring. Not to challenge the answer, not to suggest the answer is wrong, but only to examine what the word is covering and why it covers so effectively that even he cannot always see underneath it. He wakes up at the same time every morning, not because an alarm forces him to. The body has internalized the schedule so completely that the alarm has become redundant. There is no transition between sleep and function. He is simply not awake, and then he is, already calculating the day, already arranging what needs to happen before the day formally begins. The body has become efficient at skipping the part where a person eases gradually into consciousness, that slow, disorganized re-entry that children do, and that he has not done in years. He would not describe this as a problem. It would not occur to him to describe it as anything at all. It is simply how mornings work now. Watch what he does with physical discomfort. There is a tightness in his shoulder that has been present for 2 months, a fatigue that does not fully resolve with sleep. He notices these signals the way you notice background noise in a room, registered, categorized as non-critical, then set aside and largely forgotten until they surface again. The threshold for what constitutes a real problem has been calibrated steadily upward across decades. Minor signals do not reach the surface as demands. They accumulate below it instead. He talks less than he used to. This is not a dramatic change that happened at a specific moment he could identify. It happened the way erosion happens, through repetition, through the accumulation of small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. He learned through accumulated experience that certain kinds of talking produce results, and certain kinds do not. He learned to favor the former. The latter gradually stopped happening. What stopped was not conversation itself, but a particular kind of speaking, the kind where the outcome is not yet known, where you are working something out in language rather than reporting a conclusion already reached. He still talks about things that have already been processed internally, conclusions already formed, positions already established. The processing itself became invisible, even to him. There is a moment, somewhere in the late 30s or early 40s, when the cost-benefit calculation around emotional expression shifts in ways that are never consciously registered. It is not a conscious decision, nothing so deliberate as that. It's more like a gradual realization, accumulated over many small instances, that the expression of certain internal states generates more complexity than it resolves. The complexity is not worth it. The internal state can be managed alone. He becomes steadily better at managing it alone, and the improvement feels like progress. This is where the pattern begins to become visible as a pattern rather than simply as a collection of individual reasonable choices. Each choice was rational. That is the essential point. The decision not to speak about a difficulty, taken once, makes complete sense. The decision to handle something internally, taken once, is simply efficiency. The decision to absorb a frustration rather than surface it, taken once, is just good judgment about what matters and what does not. But choices always accumulate over time. What begins as a series of reasonable individual responses to specific situations eventually becomes a way of operating, and then it becomes something harder to name, Not a strategy anymore, but a structure, something that runs without being maintained, something that generates outputs without requiring inputs.
The structure runs without maintenance. That is its defining characteristic. He no longer has to choose to operate this way. The system makes its own choices now, within a range he established decades ago and then stopped examining entirely. I want to look at what sustained it, because a structure does not persist across decades without reinforcement from somewhere. He grew up inside an unwritten code, not a code that was taught explicitly, not a curriculum or doctrine or set of stated principles, but a code that was demonstrated continuously through how the adults around him handled difficulty, through what was rewarded and what was quietly ignored, through the particular silences that signaled where attention should not go and where questions should not be asked. The code had different surface formulations in different households, different regions, different class backgrounds, but the underlying logic was consistent enough across those variations to be considered genuinely generational. The logic was this: a man's value is demonstrated through what he produces and what he endures, not through what he feels or what he expresses about what he feels. The interior life is private at best, and at worst it is a liability, something that can undermine the reliability that people are depending on. What matters is what is visible and measurable: the work done, the family maintained, the crisis absorbed without destabilizing others. The rest is interior, and the interior is not for discussion. He absorbed this not as doctrine, but as atmosphere. He learned to read the room before he learned to read a book. He understood, through observation and through the feedback he received when he got it wrong, which expressions of self were acceptable and which were not. The unacceptable ones were not punished exactly, they simply produced nothing, received without response, generating no connection, no recognition, nothing that made expression feel worthwhile. Over time, you stop sending things into the void, not as a decision, but as a natural consequence of repeated unrewarded behavior. The economic context reinforced this at every stage of his adult life. He came of age during a period of significant economic disruption, recessions, structural unemployment, entire industries disappearing, new volatility entering systems that previous generations had experienced as stable and predictable. The future became less predictable. The response to less predictable futures for a certain kind of man and a certain kind of situation is to increase control over the variables that can be controlled. He increased control over himself, his emotional responses, his stated needs, his visibility as someone who might require something from someone else. He became someone who did not generate additional load on the people around him. This was, at the time, and in many ways still, a genuine contribution. It is not nothing to be reliably non-demanding in a world where demands accumulate quickly. By the time he was in his 30s, holding a job, managing a household, possibly raising children, the system was already well established. Produce output, manage your own internal states before they reach the surface, do not generate additional complexity for others, stay functional under load. And the system worked. The job got done, the household held together, the crises were absorbed and managed, functioning continued when it might have stopped. The feedback he received from the world around him confirmed repeatedly that the system was effective. The system received continuous positive reinforcement. What he did not receive feedback about was what the system was costing on the inside, because the costs were interior, and the interior is where he had stopped monitoring. Here is what I mean by costs, not in a therapeutic sense, not as a category of problems to be solved, but only as a structural observation. A system that is always running at or near functional capacity has no reserve available. He can handle what is in front of him. What he cannot easily handle is the unexpected addition, the thing that arrives when everything is already allocated and there is nothing left to allocate. This is when the system becomes visible. Not crisis necessarily, but an additional demand arriving into a system with no margin left. He becomes quieter or shorter in his responses than the situation seems to require, or he withdraws into whatever activity functions as decompression: the television, the garage, the long drive, the extended silence, and stays there longer than seems proportionate to what the immediate situation actually requires. Not because he is choosing to be distant from the people around him, but because the system is rerouting what resources remain. There is simply nothing left for the things that do not appear on the operational checklist. The people around him experience this as unavailability. He experiences it as managing the situation the only way currently available. Both of those are accurate descriptions of the same thing, and the gap between those two descriptions is where many of his closest relationships actually live. What has happened to the body in all of this deserves its own attention.
The body has been, for decades, primarily a tool, a reliable one, mostly well-maintained, maintained with the same underlying logic he applies to other systems. Enough maintenance to keep it functional, attention when something begins to threaten continued function, not much inquiry into what it is actually doing when nothing is visibly wrong. The body has been a vehicle for his functioning, and he has treated it accordingly. The body has been keeping records that he has not been reading, tension that became structural over years of sustained activation, sleep that became progressively shallower as the body stopped fully deactivating at night, an immune system running against a background load of sustained low-level arousal that was never quite urgent enough to count as stress according to the definition he was using. His operative definition of stress requires an event, a visible crisis, an external threat, a problem with a clear boundary. The definition the body uses is different and broader. The body counts everything, every small activation that was never fully resolved, every night that provided rest without full recovery, every year of operating at functional capacity without significant deactivation. He is 53 or 56 or 58 years old. He is not sick. Nothing is specifically wrong. He is tired in a way that sleep does not fully address anymore, recovers from physical exertion more slowly than he used to, recovers from difficulty of any kind more slowly. Minor difficulties produce fatigue that seems disproportionate to what the difficulty actually required. He attributes this mostly to age, and age is partly correct as an explanation. But age does not fully account for the specific profile of what has accumulated in this particular body over these particular decades. The accumulation is the result of the system operating as designed, decades of efficient, effective, sustained operation with inadequate recovery built into the design. This is not a moral failure, and there is nothing to evaluate here. It is a structural outcome of a structural design. The identity question has to be raised here because without it, the structure does not fully make sense as a system. At some point, again, not a decision, not a moment anyone could locate, his functioning became his identity. Not in a way he would recognize or describe as a problem, just in the quiet, gradual, absolute way that certain things become simply true over time without being chosen. Ask him who he is, and he will describe what he does, his role, his function, the things he is responsible for, the things that depend on him. This is not evasion and it is not deflection. It is an accurate report on how he understands himself. He has become, over decades of continuous reinforcement, the sum of his reliable functioning, the man who handles things, the man who does not fall apart, the man you can count on when things get difficult. These are not small things to be. This identity carries enormous dignity and real weight. He has earned it through genuine sacrifice and sustained effort across a long period of time, and none of that is in question. But an identity built entirely around function carries a specific structural vulnerability. It cannot accommodate non-function. If who you are is the man who handles things, then not handling something, needing help, failing to maintain, reaching a visible limit, is not just a practical problem to be solved. It is a threat to the self, the failure of what you are, rather than simply something you did not manage well this particular time. The stakes of ordinary difficulty become much higher than they need to be, because failure is not just failure, it is the failure of the only identity available. He will usually not frame it this way when he describes his own preferences. He will describe it as not wanting to burden others with things he can handle himself, as preferring independence, as simply not being a person who makes a big deal out of things or needs a lot of support. These descriptions are accurate. They are also descriptions of what an identity structure looks like from the inside when it has no available room for the full range of what human experience actually includes. What it costs him in relationships is subtle enough that it often goes unexamined for years, and by the time it is examined, it has become the shape of the relationship itself. The people closest to him learn, over time, which approaches produce usable responses and which produce nothing. They learn which doors are open and which have been quietly closed, and they navigate accordingly. They stop asking certain questions. They make accommodations that they do not always fully articulate even to themselves. They learn to read him the way he learned early on to read the rooms he grew up in. The relationship becomes shaped around what he can receive rather than around what either person actually needs. This is not blame directed at anyone. He is operating consistently within the structure he built, which was built in response to real conditions and served real purposes. The people who love him are doing their best within the same structure. What has happened is that the structure itself has become the architecture of the relationship in ways that neither party chose and that neither party has fully named to themselves or to each other. There is a specific loneliness that lives inside this structure, not the loneliness of isolation, since he is often surrounded by people who depend on him and who would describe him as central to their lives. It is the loneliness of being known only partially, of being known as the functional version of yourself, the version that manages and handles and stays steady, of having presented that version for perhaps decades, and of having that version received as the whole, because it presents itself so completely and consistently that there is no visible gap. He may not experience this in any way he would name.
He may experience it as simply how things are, the ordinary condition of adult life, which everyone navigates and which does not require particular examination. The distinction between resigned acceptance of partial connection and the actual experience of genuine connection has, over time, become less visible from inside the structure. He knows what he has. He has stopped measuring it against what else might be possible. This is the layer of the structure that is hardest to see from inside it. He is not uniquely constructed. This is what becomes visible when you look at the generation as a whole rather than at any individual man. What I have been describing is not a personal psychology that some Gen X men happen to develop through individual choices and circumstances. It is a generational adaptation, a response that an entire cohort developed, largely in parallel and without coordination, to a largely shared set of conditions. The cultural code that established what a man's value consisted of and how it was to be demonstrated, the economic disruptions that made self-sufficiency feel less like a preference and more like a survival strategy, the specific historical positioning of this generation, old enough to have fully absorbed pre-feminist norms around male stoicism and self-containment, young enough to watch those norms become inadequate for the world that was actually arriving without being offered workable alternatives. He built this structure in response to real conditions that were actually present. So did the man next to him, and the one next to him. The structure that feels so private and individual turns out, on examination, to be almost collective in its architecture. The same walls and the same places, built from the same materials for the same reasons across millions of separate lives. No one coordinated this. There was no agreement, no instruction, no shared intention. There was only the same set of conditions producing across millions of men who never met each other variations on the same adaptive response. They all became, in their separate ways in their separate lives, versions of the man who is fine. The collective dimension is where the invisibility becomes complete and self-sustaining. When everyone around you is operating the same way, the way of operating does not look like a response to conditions. It does not look like an adaptation. It looks like reality, like how men simply are, what they naturally do, what they naturally are, what the word man simply means. The adaptation has been so thorough and so widely shared and so consistently confirmed by the behavior of every other man in the surrounding environment that it has become indistinguishable from nature itself. He does not see himself as someone who adapted to conditions. He sees himself as someone who simply is this way. The distinction matters more than it might appear to, because an adaptation can be examined while a nature cannot. You cannot investigate what you cannot see as something other than what has always been true. This is the deepest layer of the structure, not the behavior itself, not the habit that behavior became, not the identity that habit built, not the relationship patterns the identity shaped, not the meaning the relationships carry. The deepest layer is the invisibility of it all together, the way the entire system has become so thoroughly internalized, so widely normalized among the people he compares himself to, so completely confirmed by the behavior of everyone around him who is operating the same way, that it no longer presents itself as a system at all. It presents itself as simply what is. The fine report is generated by the structure. The report is delivered without examination. It is received as accurate by everyone who hears it, including by him. The loop closes, the investigation does not happen, and the structure remains invisible. This has been occurring without interruption for decades. This is where the investigation stops rather than concludes. Not because the territory has been exhausted, but because what I have traced is a structure that is only visible at all when someone looks at it directly and deliberately. That looking does not happen automatically from inside the structure. It can only happen from some small distance, the kind of distance that an investigation like this one briefly creates if it has been working. The recognition this creates is not a solution, and none is being offered here. But recognition is the only thing that can interrupt the automatic generation of the report. It is the small gap in the loop through which something else can briefly enter. Something in the system has been running for a very long time, fine in a way that has never been examined, functioning and costing simultaneously, registered on only one of those dimensions for most of his adult life. That is what this investigation found. That is where it stops. If something in this reached you, something familiar that has been present without a name, something you have been moving around without quite looking at directly, leave it in the comments. Not to fix anything, only because the collective blind spot becomes slightly less complete every time one person names what they have been seeing. The investigation continues in the next one. There is a specific layer that follows directly from what we examined today. How the same structure that generates the fine report also quietly shapes what a Gen X man still allows himself to want, and what he has learned to not want at all. That territory is worth approaching carefully. If you want to be present when that examination continues, subscribe. No performance, no promotion, just the next investigation when it is ready.